Hello, everyone. Welcome to NSLI Interactive's first virtual event of the 2021 calendar year, entitled Sharing Your Story, Speaking and Writing About Cultural Exchange. My name is Alexander, and I work for the NSLI team at IRN USA. My colleagues Zagaya and Kyle will be helping out with this event as well. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Before we start this presentation today, let's quickly go over some functions in Zoom, as well as the outline for the event. You can feel free to rename yourself so just your first name appears if you'd like. And also make sure, of course, that you're muted while the presenters or a fellow attendee is speaking. Video is optional during the presentations. The event will begin with a brief introduction to the NSLI program and a short icebreaker question. Then each of our 5 alumni panelists will give a presentation. After this time, we will have a question and answer session with the panelists. So please be thinking of any questions you may want to ask them when it is time for the Q&A. During this time, you can use the raise hand function to be called on, and then unmute yourselves in order to interact with the guest speakers. You can also private message me on Zoom at any point with your questions, and I can ask them to the speakers. As a reminder, this event ends at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Next slide, please. Before our speakers present, I want to give some background information for anyone not familiar with the NSLI program. The National Security Language Initiative for Youth, NSLI, is a scholarship program for American high school students funded by the U.S. Department of State, Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. Every year, NSLI brings around 600 students overseas to study a critical language such as Arabic, Chinese, Hindi, Indonesian, Korean, Russian, Turkish, and Persian for a summer or academic year. Students on NSLI programs immerse themselves in the local culture, practice citizen diplomacy, and work to become experts in their language. The NSLI program has a lifelong impact, and our speakers today will speak to that. Before we get started, I'd like to do a quick poll to find out who we have in the audience with us today. Please feel free to share your answers in the chat as well. So without further ado, let me launch that poll. 1 second, please. Okay, I'll close the poll in just a few moments. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. So I'll quickly share the results. So it looks like we have a good amount of both prospective applicants and alumni here. And I think that's great because what we're going to talk about today is applicable to both groups. And it seems like we also have some staff and family here as well. So as I mentioned, today we will hear from 5 NSLI alumni of the Hindi program. And I'm going to give a brief introduction for each of them right now. We have Alice. She is an alumna of the 2017-2018 NSLI Hindi Academic Year program. She is currently in a gap year between her first and second years at university. Alice is spending the year working in community engagement at a nonprofit organization serving migrants, where she enjoys speaking Hindi and Urdu with clients. In her free time, she likes to read, hike, and spend time outdoors. Alice hopes to work in immigration and asylum law. Kane is an alumnus of the 2020 NSLI Virtual Summer Intensive Hindi program and is currently a high school senior. He hopes to use his foreign language and cultural skills in his future career as a physicist. He likes to work out, play basketball, draw, and learn languages. Taryn is an alumna of the 2019 NSLI Hindi Summer Program and is currently an International Baccalaureate high school senior. She has studied the Hindi language for 6 years and uses her passion for cultural exchange to lead the Youth International Summit organization. She intends to study global business in college and encourages students to pursue international experiences in any way possible, but especially through NSLI. Olivia is an alumna of the 2019 NSLI Hindi Summer Program. She is in her second year of university and is pursuing a BS in neuroscience and social policy. In her free time, she enjoys organic farming, reading, and listening to podcasts. After graduation, she plans to go to medical school or law school. And last but not least, there's Krista, who is an alumna of the 2016 NSLI Hindi Summer Program, and she recently graduated from university. Since participating in NSLI, she has studied abroad in India again on a critical language scholarship and a semester program at the American Institute of Indian Studies. She has also interned in the nonprofit sector in India. In her free time, Krista dances, teaches, and continues language study. She is happy to support other students passionate about language learning and cultural exchange. For those who cannot join us live today, we are recording this webinar and we'll post it on our NSLI Interactive website. I will now pass it off to our alumni panelists to begin with the presentations. Alice, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. As Alexander said, my name is Alice. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm currently on a gap year between my first and second years of college, working at a nonprofit serving immigrants and refugees. And yeah, I'm really excited to be speaking with you all today. If you could go to the next slide, please. So I'll be speaking today about storytelling in workshops, and I'm using the word workshops in a little bit of a loose sense, but I'm sure as many of you feel or will feel after you return from your programs, in May of 2018, I was really excited to talk to NSLI or about NSLI to pretty much anyone who would listen. And so the easiest and most accessible place for me to do that was locally. So I began hosting workshops at my high school, other local high schools, and also public libraries in the area. I both shared my own personal NSLI experience, as well as information about applications, not just about NSLI, but also about other State Department study abroad scholarships as well. I found at my high school, it was best to reach out to language teachers, civics teachers, as well as, the teacher who wrote my NSLI application. Typically, teachers, want to support their students, and this is a really great accessible opportunity for them to do that. Public libraries as well will often have a youth librarian. I also really enjoyed connecting with local exchange students in my community, both students from the US who had gone on exchange programs, including State Department scholarship programs, but also students from abroad who are studying in my home community. For instance, my senior year of high school, one of my closest friends became a student from India who was studying at my school for the year. Not only were we able to watch Bollywood movies together and speak Hindi, but we also, hosted ice cream socials. She came to all of my NSLI workshops, and we were able to share kind of both ways about our study abroad experience, which was awesome. And then when conducting these presentations, it's really important to keep accessibility in mind and to be mindful of barriers that people may face as they consider leaving home, especially to go abroad. It's really important, obviously, to spread the word as far and wide as possible, but it's just as essential for us as alumni to think about how this opportunity could be made more feasible and accessible to students for whom study abroad isn't viable for a number of reasons, including economic. If you could go to the next slide, please. So there are also a number of NSLI-specific opportunities that are great ways to share your experience. Pre-COVID, all of the interviews would be conducted at libraries or high schools, community organizations, where they would invite alumni to come and speak with potential applicants and their parents. So I've spent many enjoyable evenings eating Subway catered sandwiches and speaking with applicants. And it was, really meaningful to be able to share my own stories while also learning about their motivations for studying with NSLI. And I think it is really helpful. Can be a nerve-wracking experience. It's many students' first interviews to speak together. There are also orientations, both local and national, for NSLI programs. So since returning, I've been to all of the local orientations for my implementing organization, which was AFS, or American Field Service. And I spoke with students from the US who were going all over the place, not just India, and not just to learn languages, but there are always commonalities we can find in our study abroad experiences. And then very specific to NSLI and the Hindi program, I was lucky enough to go to the national orientation for the group of students heading to India with AFS the summer after I returned. I could give them a little bit of a Hindi lesson and talk about, what they might expect and what they had to look forward to, which was great. I'm also a big fan of more unconventional places to share about our NSLI experiences, workshops or otherwise. So I'm from the Midwest, and I'm from Wisconsin, where there aren't a lot of places being shoved right in your face to practice speaking Hindi. And in my city, what was accessible for me was to get a job as a server at an Indian restaurant owned by Hindi-speaking immigrants from India. And so I could both, share about my time in India with them. The picture in the middle is us after my high school graduation, but also with customers and other people who are kind of like, whoa, why does she speak Hindi? So, and then finally, I think, my biggest piece of advice is to share specific and personal narratives. So before I left, I knew different languages had different implementing organizations, and obviously we're going to different countries, we'll all have different experiences. But the more I reflect on my NSLI experience, I realize how unique each person's experience is. I had very different experiences from the 4 other young women in my cohort, and we were at the same city and the same school. And so the best presentations will be very specific and personal to your own experience. For me personally, I often like to share about Mishra sir, who's pictured in the left. He was one of my Hindi teachers. He was 84 years old at the time, and he often taught by sharing stories and wisdom that demonstrated his deep commitment to equality and caring for humankind. So that was, a really special aspect of my NSLI program and something I love to talk about. So that's all from me. I look forward to answering questions and listening to the other presentations. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that great presentation, Alice. It was really interesting to hear the different ways you kind of told your NSLI story. Now we're going to have a presentation from Kane.
Okay, hello. So my name is Kane, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about my experience learning Hindi for 6 weeks with NSLI. So first, I should say that my experience with NSLI was a little bit different than most people's because I was online. I did like the virtual summer intensive program. So although it was a lot different than I initially expected when I signed up for a study abroad program, I definitely there's definitely a lot of rich experiences that I got out of it, out of the program, even though it was online. So so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Sanskrit language and how I used some of my final project for the NSLI program to do interviews and learn more about ancient Sanskrit literature. So Sanskrit is one of the many ancient languages of India. There's tons of language diversity in India. There's not just Hindi, there's Gujarati, Marathi, Odia, there's tons of languages. Next slide, please. Yep. And of those many languages, Sanskrit is one of them. And Sanskrit is sort of like the mother language to a lot of the modern Indian languages, similar to how English and Spanish and French all have Latin or Greek to kind of be the predecessors, to be the mother language. That's how it is for Hindi, and Gujarati for Sanskrit. So, for example, here you can see that the writing system is exactly the same. This is both the alphabet for Hindi and Sanskrit. So when I was trying to learn a little bit of Sanskrit on my own, just kind of for fun, I didn't it was it was a lot easier to learn a tiny bit of Sanskrit than it would be to learn a completely new language like Japanese or something. Next. Thank you. So here's a bit of a tree representing how the origin of Indo-Aryan languages. So obviously you have Hindi and Urdu, that's at the very top right, and all these languages came from Sanskrit. Next. Okay, so my I guess my main thing, my main final project that I did for the NSLI program is I wrote an article, a pretty long essay on Sanskrit, ancient Sanskrit literature. And I wrote about like the different, there's tons of different literature that came from India, like about 1600 BC, like the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, there's the Rig Veda, there's tons of Vedic texts. There's like a wealth of literature that I wanted to learn about, that kind of informed the modern culture of India that was written in Sanskrit. So my essay, like that I just kind of wrote, was pretty long, and I published it on Medium, and a decent number of people read it, which like I kind of wanted to, which I think is really amazing, because a lot of people who may not have gotten into the subject, people who probably have never even like heard of it before, are now like learning about this new thing, which I think is really cool. Next. Yep. So as part of my like research into Sanskrit literature, I conducted interviews. So I asked my mentor, with my like mentor, to put me in contact with people who are a bit more knowledgeable about the subject than me. So I talked to one guy, the guy in the top left, that's Anuj. He's a student from, he's a student in India, and he was super knowledgeable about like all of like Indian and even like English literature. And we talked for about like an hour about like how it's impacted India, how like the different texts have like made like Bollywood and like all the things that we like love about India today, and how it's like super influential, even though it's, you know, even though it's over 2,000 years old. And the lady in the bottom left is Dr. Parekh. I spoke with her. She has her PhD in Sanskrit literature, which I think is pretty amazing, because without like the program, without like the VSI program, I probably never would have gotten into contact with somebody like so knowledgeable about like this one subject that I actually had a lot of interest in. Next. And then I also published like my, like a snippet of my article on the like interactive website, which is like a platform where people who are like in NSLI can like publish articles, or publish articles on things that interest them. So I wrote an article on there too, again about Sanskrit literature, and it was definitely like really cool learning about the publishing process in general, because I've before this, I'd never really published anything for like broad consumption. Like obviously, like in school and stuff, you write essays, but you almost never get to like express your views to the broader world, which I think is pretty cool that I was able to do that. Next. Okay, never mind. Okay, so um, the can you go back one? Just a little bit more. Yeah. All right. So writing about this, like writing about this article and stuff, like really helped me when I was writing about my NSLI experience in general. Like when I was talking on like college applications and stuff. And like even in one of my like, college interviews, I remember like I mentioned the fact that I spoke Hindi, and like the lady was like super impressed. She was like, "Well, like how do you know that?" And I also told her I knew a bit of Sanskrit, and like that was like mind blowing for her. So I think it's a really cool skill to have, and yeah. So
Thank you so much, Kane, for that presentation. And I really loved hearing about your passion for this language that I don't think many high schoolers might choose to pick up, but it's amazing to hear how fascinated you are by it. And I hope that you're able to continue and able to connect with those experts like you were able to do this past summer. Now we're going to hear from Taryn.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Kane and Alice, for such interesting presentations. So hello, everyone. My name is Taryn. I am a Summer Hindi 2019 alumna from Texas, and I will be discussing NSLI's role in your college apps. Next slide, please. So here's just a quick kind of table of contents. I really want to focus on how NSLI can be integrated into your college apps, where it goes, and especially how you can expand on it in your essays. Next slide, please. So there's about me. Next slide. So I spent the summer of 2019 in Pune, India. I'm currently a senior in high school from Dallas, Texas, and I've studied Hindi for 6 years through my school's World Language Program. I'm also planning to major in global business and international development. And this picture is me and my host mom. She's an amazing makeup artist. We had a great time. Next slide, please. So a bit about college apps. I saw that there are lots of prospective NSLI students here, which means there are lots of high schoolers here. So here's how I broke it down. NSLI can go into your activities and extracurricular section, or your awards and honors section, or your summer experiences section. So in each section here, I've kind of expanded on how you can integrate NSLI into your college application. For me, what I ended up doing most often was under the awards and honors. I would discuss how it was a scholarship from the US Department of State, how you have to apply for it. It's a competitive merit-based award. This will really make NSLI stand out academically to your college admissions committees. And this is also a great space. Typically, they have very limited character counts, word counts, but really expand on, how you went to school every day, you studied a language, you might have done some interesting field trips, service projects for the local community. Those are all great things to highlight in your application. Next slide, please. So this is something that I really think is important for prospective NSLI students to know, is that you don't have to be planning to go into any one career to be interested in NSLI-Y. So what I hear pretty often is that students go into NSLI and they think they can only do it because they want to be a foreign service officer or they want to work in law or international relations. While NSLI is great for those careers, that's not true at all, that it's only for those. NSLI can in fact fit into public policy, communications, music and the arts, medicine and engineering. I mean, as you heard Alexander mention about Olivia, she's actually looking at going into neuroscience or medicine or law. So a lot of NSLI alumni have a very diverse range of careers. And then lastly, you have business and law. Here are some examples on how you can fit NSLI-Y into your career and what aspects of NSLI can really work into those fields specifically. Next slide, please. And next is the essay. So this is the meat of my presentation, and I really want to show you guys how I incorporate these essays. So here's one prompt. What skills do you find most useful in adapting to changing environments? So something to start off with is in every essay you discuss NSLI in, you'll need to make sure that you kind of introduce it. So come up with like a concise introduction, say US Department of State Merit Scholarship, 6-week study abroad program in Pune, India, or in South Korea, or Indonesia, wherever you went. And after that, talk about not only your experience, but reflect on that experience. So that means present some specific events that you remember, your favorite memories, what a typical day in your life as a NSLI student was, and then reflect on that. You'll want to say, how it affected you, what you thought of it, how this was a huge change for you, or how this maybe reminded you of home in the US. And so for me, I talked about how when I felt nervous about going on the trip, I would research interesting things about Pune. So specifically for my trip, there was iconic street food, historical cultural sites, and natural beauty of the Western Ghats on the western coast of India. So those are all things that you could highlight about your location to really characterize it, make your essay stand out. And one way I reflected on that is that I learned just as much Hindi in the classroom as I did traveling with my host family. So I would have conversations with people while we went street shopping, ordering at restaurants, meeting new people, and using a language is just as important as learning it because it really solidifies it in your mind. So there's one essay. Next slide, please. Here's another example. This is asking about, is there a particular work of art from which you've drawn insight or inspiration? So the first essay prompt was, it was a pretty clear connection to NSLI. I mean, changing environments and international travel, they just are a natural fit. But this is one that you can kind of fit NSLI into in place of something that you could have put in from your life here in the US. So that's another thing that I think is really important, is that you can use NSLI to answer just about any essay prompt because it's such a meaningful, impactful experience. So for this one, I talked about English of English, a pretty famous Bollywood movie that I watched first when I was really young, just starting to learn Hindi, and I watched it again in India with my NSLI cohort. And I kind of use that one movie to trace my journey learning the Hindi language. So I started it off when I was brand new learning it. And when I was in India with my cohort, I reflected on the movie as kind of gaining a new understanding of what Shashi was going through. You know, as I mentioned on my slide, she is a native Hindi speaker and she goes to the US. So she's kind of lost before she learns English, trying to she has to rely on her family and, you know, the kindness of strangers to get around until her language skills get better. And it was exactly the same for us in India as NSLI students. So I found that really insightful. And then another thing you can do in your essays that really stands out and shows the impact that your NSLI trip had on you is my last bullet point. So you want to show, how did you impact your community? How did you make the most of your NSLI experience and share it? So as Alice mentioned, she did lots of workshops, lots of community outreach. That is definitely something that you'd want to highlight in your essays for any prospective NSLI student. And next slide. So this is the last essay, and there's no particular prompt because every college application will have just a general essay. Sometimes they'll just say, tell us about yourself, tell us your story, a very general thing. And this is a great place to include NSLI, if not have your entire essay focus specifically on NSLI. And so this is where you'll want to kind of use it as a tool to convey like a wider message. So for me personally, I use this as my Common App essay that was about overcoming adversity, and I used it to convey personal growth. So I talked about probably my most unforgettable memory of India when I was chosen to present our closing ceremony in Hindi, but also got food poisoning that same night. And so working through that experience and eventually being able and overcoming it and being able to present at the ceremony, that was something that I could focus in on to discuss about NSLI. And then you can zoom out and talk about, how does that impact your journey of learning a language as a whole? How did that change the way you even think about travel and your language skills and everything? So as I highlighted, you can discuss the program as a stepping stone to some kind of change, and also show that NSLI was deeper than just a study abroad trip or, you know, a travel experience or vacation. Really show how it impacted you. Next slide, please. And so in closing, that pretty much wraps up my presentation on your college applications. If I can leave you with one thing, it's that please do not leave NSLI-Y out of your college applications. It can only help you. It's an amazing experience. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Taryn, and thank you for highlighting how applicable the NSLI experience is across any sort of field that you can think of, the skills that you take from it. Now we're going to be hearing from Olivia.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Taryn. That was a great presentation. I wish I had had it when I was applying to college. But as Alexander introduced earlier, my name is Olivia. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a second year in college studying neuroscience and social and environmental policy on the pre-med track. You can go to the next slide, please. So I am also a summer 2019 Hindi alumna, and so here are some pictures from my experience of favorite days learning in school with friends. Those are my host siblings in the center. Those are just some of my favorite moments. I feel like it's always good to share happy memories from the program as well. And I also just wanted to note that I went right after I graduated from high school, which was a little different. There were only 3 of us on my program that were going right after we graduated from high school. So I felt like NSLI had a pretty big impact on my college experience, even though it wasn't a part of my college application process. It impacted a lot once I got to college. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Next slide, please. One of the biggest lessons that I took away from my time in India was not just the language learning, but learning about individual environmental advocacy and environmental justice. there was a lot of flooding going on while we were studying there over the summer. And so we would have like a lot of conversations in class, because a lot of times our homework was to bring in different news articles or talk about what was going on in the news. So we would talk about kind of like the political, but also like environmental and social determinants of like health that were changing with that and other issues that were changing with that. Got me really interested in like how all of that was happening. These are signs from like outside of our school. So it was also very clear that like from a young age, personal like environmental advocacy is like very strong in the society there. And it got me really interested in that, which got me interested in potentially like continuing to pursue that academically once I got to college. And then also we wrote essays while we were there, and I chose to write my essay on environmental justice in Pune specifically. And I think that like the act of like telling that story and talking about it and writing it down like really helped me to kind of like solidify what my interests were and how they had changed and how I had grown while I was on the program. Next slide, please. So yes, so essentially when I got to college, I found NSLI to be helpful in several ways. As I mentioned, it kind of shaped what I wanted to study. Then when I went into college, like undecided, once I was meeting with my advisor, I was like talking about NSLI and like how great it was and how interested I was in the environment there. And that was when I decided that I might want to study environmental policy, but I also knew that I was still interested in medicine. So when I was talking with like my pre-med advisor, she was like, oh no, that's like absolutely great. Like the communication skills you learned both like in Hindi and in English, whether that be communication skills I gained with my host family, with my teachers, with my peers, the ability to like communicate myself really effectively in multiple languages would be extremely useful for me on the pre-med track, and it has helped me to find volunteering and clinical opportunities. So I just want to highlight that like you don't need to be pursuing a career or pursuing a degree in medicine in order to make NSLI help you out in college. It also specifically helped me connect with my the current lab that I do research in. It's in the anthropology department, which is also not like super related to international relations. But during my interview, I was talking about my NSLI experience, and the professor that I was interviewing with said that one of the other research assistants had done NSLI, and she was like, oh my gosh, NSLI kids are always really great kids. They always have such good work ethic. She's actually worked with 2 previously. So that really helped me in securing my research position in college, which has been an absolutely outstanding experience academically. And then I just wanted to touch on and say that NSLI helped me not just academically, but socially once I reached college. I felt that like talking about my experiences in India, like both learning Hindi and like learning different types of dance and all sorts of aspects of culture helped me to start conversations with new people and to build new connections socially in college. So one of those opportunities that I took advantage of that I would highly recommend was trying out for ROS, which was one of the Indian dance teams on my college campus. It was so much fun to try out, and I had so much fun like meeting all of the new people. And another one is I go on Fridays still, there's like a Hindi lunch table program. I wasn't able to fit Hindi classes into my college schedule, but I have this opportunity to continue to speak Hindi and meet all sorts of new students. So I really feel like my experience with NSLI helped me a lot academically and socially when I got to college. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that's all. Very excited to talk with people afterwards.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing, Olivia, and also for explaining how NSLI can be so useful, not just professionally or academically, but also socially and personally. And last but not least, we have Krista.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Olivia. That was fantastic. Again, my name is Krista. I use she, her pronouns, and this is my presentation. If you could go to the next slide, please. All right, so I am a little bit one of, I guess, the oldest alumni here. I participated in NSLI in the summer of 2016. I also, like Olivia, did it the summer right after my senior year. Like I literally moved abroad 2 days after graduation. And I recently graduated from a school in Washington, DC, about a year ago with my BA in International Affairs. This is me and my host family. I still talk to them almost every week. I have visited them more times than I can count. Every time I go back to India, I make sure to go to Pune. If you could go to the next slide, please. All right, so tonight I'm going to be talking about three main things. That is continuing language study, forming interdisciplinary and transregional connections after your NSLI experience, and also gaining professional experience. We've gotten a great presentation on how to integrate NSLI into your college applications, and so I want to broaden that context and talk about life beyond college or life beyond school. All right, next slide. Okay, so I did not have Hindi in my university. And in fact, I had really no idea that I would want to pursue Hindi or Urdu in university. I was actually going into college as mostly a Farsi Persian studying student. But I was fortunate enough to continue studying Hindi because I fell in love with it. After NSLI, I continued studying through CLS, which is a critical language scholarship. And I'm sure a large part of this audience is perhaps familiar with that. I kind of liken it to like the college version of NSLI. And I also spent a semester at the American Institute of Indian Studies after I graduated. So I was there for 7 months during 2020. And then I've also interned in Jaipur. And I've used Hindi in many, many contexts. Next slide, please. All right, so I understand that going abroad, even on a full scholarship, is not always the easiest, most accessible thing to do. But fear not, there are other ways to continue language study. Sometimes you have to get creative. So downloading language language learning apps, getting books and poetry in your language. I have ordered many poetry anthologies and different novels off of Amazon. Obviously, and Alice and some others sort of touched on this, but getting involved with the local community from your host country, on-campus cultural organizations, as Olivia was talking about, movies and music in your language, of course, for Hindi students, this is great. We have Bollywood. And then, of course, online classes. There are a lot of opportunities that are low cost or even free that are online. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience. I went into NSLI sort of from that stereotypical like foreign service officer track, and that you know, my perspective changed throughout college. I ended up holding a Middle East studies concentration in undergrad, and I connected this quite well with my experiences in India. So because of these, I developed sort of my own academic niche. I study South Asian Islam, and so I use Hindi and Urdu a lot for my research. I also use Farsi and Arabic, and a surprising amount of German. So, you know, whatever field you end up going into, you might be surprised as to how your language training comes into play. So next slide, please. And I'm always surprised at when I connect with other NSLI alumni, some of the interests that we share, even if it's somebody who, you know, did a Korean program or a Russian program or something that sort of ostensibly I don't know as much about. I always find that there is sort of a nexus that our interests fit into. And this works across disciplines too. You know, we've been mentioning, right, that you don't necessarily have to be like a humanities person or a public policy person to enjoy NSLI and use NSLI in sort of your life post NSLI. So I've connected with a lot of people who are in the STEM fields or doing medicine and all of these different things. And we have some really cool common interests. Next slide. All right, so now we get to the part where you get to sort of take your experience out into quote unquote the real world. And your NSLI experience, no matter what, is always going to be valuable. So over the past few years, I have worked on Capitol Hill. I've worked for several NGOs, both in the US in Washington, DC, and in India. I've also been a campaign manager for a political election. And in each of these scenarios, I've used my experiences In India, my NSLI experience in multiple different ways. You never know how your regional language or how your regional knowledge is going to come into play, or how your language knowledge is going to come into play. Sometimes it's just as much as having the abilities to overcome challenges that will help you out. But sometimes it's a little bit more specific. So for example, I interned for the Space Foundation when I was in college, which again, on the surface, like doesn't seem necessarily like it's fits right in with NSLI. But we worked a lot with international relations and sort of knowing what it was like to live in a different culture, live in a different country was incredibly helpful. And the knowledge of global affairs itself was also incredibly helpful. So next slide, please. So this is what I sort of want to impart to all of you as my main point, is that the most valuable part of an experience like NSLI, in my opinion, is that you learn to communicate across cultural and linguistic barriers. You're not going to be fluent in your target language, and you're not going to know everything about your host culture when you go there. And so you are going to make mistakes, and you're going to embarrass yourself, and you're going to have to learn to communicate in a language that is not your mother tongue. And this gives you an incredible skill set to take back into the world, to take back into your community. You, more than anything, have the ability to adapt and to take on new challenges, and people will learn to value that about you if they don't already. All right, next slide. So that's it for me. I am extremely floored by the wonderful presentations that we've seen tonight. I'm happy to answer any questions and provide support to any about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing, Krista, and for sharing how this can connect to one's professional goals and how the skill set is so important in so many different domains. So as the slide indicates, now that everyone has presented, it is time for the Q&A portion of the event. Please use the raise hand function so I can call on you to ask a question, or if you prefer, you can also write the message directly into the chat box. You could also private message me your question as well, so there's a few different ways to ask your questions. I'm going to start by asking a question or two, but please feel free to raise your hand so I can call on you. So I want to ask this question to everyone, and if someone will speak up, that's great. If not, I can call on someone. So I want to hear about what responsibility do NSLI alumni have to be citizen diplomats after their NSLI program ends? How can NSLI alumni continue this work of citizen diplomacy beyond language learning?
I can answer first if that's okay. I would say that a key responsibility that we have after we live in a country for 6 weeks or even an academic year, once we come back to the US, I would say it's our responsibility to kind of disseminate and push back against stereotypes, especially negative stereotypes against our target language, our target culture, our host country in general. I know that sometimes in the US, the way that schools teach or the general perception of a certain country or culture might be very, very different from the reality. And I think we do have the responsibility to like speak up and kind of support what we experienced as opposed to, you know, a biased view of another country.
Thank you. Would someone else like to share their own response?
Yeah, I think that like in whatever field you go in, because like me personally, like I'm going to college to study like physics and computer science, and like it's not like super like obviously applicable to like languages or anything, but like it's actually kind of like I've had a ton of like intercultural experiences through like for example, like I do a lot of coding, and there's these hackathons, which are these, it's kind of like a where you get together with like a team of people and you create an app in like a short period of time. And I did a project recently with some people in India who are overseas, because there's like a big like computer science thing there, and we actually ended up like winning like a lot of prizes and stuff for an app we made, and like they thought it was like super cool that I knew Hindi. And I think that like making sure to form like cultural connections and literally like whatever you're going into is super important, even if it's not like super obvious how it applies to language.
I'll just add that I think my NSLI program really reaffirmed my commitment to social justice as a citizen diplomat. I think the skills you learn on NSLI, being able to learn about others' perspectives on their own terms, learn about others' lived experiences on their own terms, are skills that are really essential to our experience as American citizen diplomats. And I've aspired to do, the same thing, teaching English as a second language to immigrants in my community. I think, showing appreciation for others' cultural backgrounds and represents values like inclusivity and empathy, which are kind of make up my experience as an American and as a citizen diplomat.
Great, thank you so much. I'll have another question now, and I'm going to direct this towards Olivia and Krista, since you guys didn't answer the last one. So I wonder if each of you can answer this following question. So we heard a lot from panelists about storytelling from the NSLI and from the perspective of NSLI alumni. Can you share about a time when you were able to listen to a story from a local person in India? And how did being the recipient or listener to this story, to this other storyteller, shape your experience of being a NSLI student and alumni?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first on this one. I think because I've had perhaps now a sort of cornucopia of experiences back in India, I've had a lot of interactions with people, particularly I was working with religious minorities in India at one point. And unfortunately, sometimes the politics around language in India can be very difficult and controversial. And I am very appreciative of sort of the access that I've had to perhaps some of these more subaltern or less heard demographics. And it helped me contextualize my NSLI experience and sort of all of my Hindi language learning experiences, because I knew more about the politics of language in India. I knew more about the history of language in India. It's also something that's impacted my research, of course. And I think it's just made me a more responsible scholar and provided me with a little bit more of a nuanced view of the subject material. Obviously, when you go to a different country, you are very honored to be a visitor there. And I think that there's a huge duty to, take on that role. So, yeah.
Thank you. Olivia, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was like one of the most impactful parts of the program, was being able to like listen to other stories while we were there and like learn about different experiences. But I also think that like a lot of people in the communities that we were in had great advice to offer in terms of like what we might want to take out of the experience and like how to like grow most. And I think like two really big examples of that were like, one being like we had 3 Hindi teachers in school, but like my specific teacher, Vrushali, was just like amazing. And I've been lucky enough to stay in touch with her, but she like spent a lot of time, as I said, like talking with us about like current events in the news and talking about how like it was not just important for us to be able to like learn Hindi, but to like understand, kind of as Krista mentioned, like the political and social implications of like that language and what it was doing, and that it was like more important than like just knowing grammar and stuff like that. And I think that she like through sharing her personal stories of like teaching so many different generations of NSLI-Y students, like how that could be impactful. And I think another great example of that is that we spent time volunteering one weekend at a center for adults with disabilities, and we were able to learn a little bit more about how that is in some Indian cultures, but also the leader for that center, when speaking to us, talked to us about like the importance of like immersing yourself in service in other cultures. And so I think that was also like particularly impactful, just like hearing her story of like the community-based organization that she was running and how like mixing cultural experiences allowed her to also like give back in that way. So those were two impactful ways that I think listening to stories in the community that I was in helped me to like think deeper about my experience.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia. That was a really insightful answer. We have a question from the audience here, and please, if you're in the audience, feel free to ask any question in the chat box. So Chris, I'm going to direct this towards you because I think you're well suited for it. The question is NSLI a stepping stone to CLS?
Okay, yeah, I like this question because I get it asked a lot. So the first time I applied to CLS, I made it to semi-finalist status and then got rejected. And I ended up doing the internship that I had in Jaipur that summer, and it was probably the best rejection that I've ever gotten because of that. That obviously, eventually I got into CLS, and of course, NSLI helped me get there. For me, NSLI was my first intense experience with Hindi itself. And a lot of other people in our cohort were also NSLI alumni. I don't know if stepping stone is the right word. I think that NSLI in itself should be treated as its own incredible experience. Obviously, both CLS and NSLI are very, very similar. And there's a lot of overlap in, you know, the group of people that participate in them. I certainly think that all NSLI alumni, if they enjoyed their experience, they should apply for CLS. But you're at a different age, and so there's different sort of benefits that you get from either program. But certainly everyone should apply.
Yeah, I'll also add, I actually did CLS Urdu this fall. It was a virtual program pushed back to the fall. And I think Krista, what you said was perfect. I'd also just add that many NSLI applicants apply for CLS when they get to college. When I talk to my college friends about NSLI, I call it CLS Junior. But the pool of CLS participants is much, much wider. It's open to everyone in higher education, so grad students, I think professional school students, and so no one on my CLS program had done NSLI. But for me, you know, I certainly wouldn't have applied to CLS or felt, I think, as able to take on the experience if I hadn't done NSLI.
Thank you for sharing, Alice. So I have another question kind of more directly about storytelling, and this can be for anyone to answer. I'm curious about when you kind of returned home after NSLI, because sharing stories of your NSLI experience provides an opportunity to connect people with a culture they may not know about. Maybe your family, friends, or others in the local community aren't as intimately familiar with the culture you might have experienced during your time on NSLI. So is there a time you were able to form a positive connection with someone based on sharing your stories from NSLI? Were you able to maybe teach them something new? And did you learn anything about yourself in the process?
Well, I know I've been answering a lot of questions, so I'll just say very briefly that Olivia and I are actually from the same city. We've known each other for many, many years, but we had not met up in a good long while until we realized that I had done NSLI and she was going to do NSLI in a couple of weeks. And so being able to get coffee and talk about the program with her was a really meaningful way to reconnect with an old friend.
I want to add, kind of going off of what Alice talked about in her presentation, how she found a job at a local Indian restaurant. In North Texas, there's a lot of, you know, small Indian grocery stores and restaurants and everything. And it's always so surprising and rewarding to see the look on people's faces when they're native speakers and you tell them that you can speak Hindi or that you went to India for several weeks or months. And they're instantly like interested in talking to you about it, asking what you thought, and it's a great conversation starter, and it always leaves people with like a positive impression, knowing that you made the effort to really learn about their culture and be involved and like immerse yourself in it. So I would say that it's definitely a great way to connect with you know, the South Asian community in your area, but also, you know, in regards to any NSLI language, that's a connection you didn't have before that program.
Great. Thank you for sharing. We just got 2 questions from the audience, so let's try to get through those before the event ends. So first, we have a really interesting question. If you could do your NSLI trip over, what would you do differently?
I will answer this one because I think about this a lot. As sort of a like fresh learner of Hindi going into my experience, I was quite intimidated by trying to speak Hindi. And unfortunately, I sometimes feel like I didn't use it enough. I was also, you know, for anyone that knows about Indian geography, Pune, people speak Marathi mostly, like just out and about. And that can make it a little bit harder to interact in your target language when it's Hindi. But I definitely would be more serious about sort of integrating the language, you know, with my host family and out and about and things like that. But yeah.
For me, I think that I might have like done a little bit more study like pre-program of my language. So once I'd gotten into NSLI, I did a little bit of studying of Hindi beforehand, but I feel like I could have like definitely taken a bit more advantage of like the couple of months that I had between getting like accepted and actually starting the program to really like get a really solid foundation so that I could hit the ground running when I started the program.
Kind of going off of what Krista said, being in Pune and being in India, where a lot of people do speak very good English, it's really tempting sometimes to just lapse into speaking English when people speak to you in English first. And, you know, as a language learner, sometimes you do get really tired. Sometimes it's been a long day. Sometimes you just don't have the mental capacity to push yourself to speaking in a new language instead of your native tongue. So I would really try to push myself to speak Hindi as much as I could and resist the temptation to speak English even when spoken to first in English.
Thank you so much for sharing, everyone. We got one last question, and I think I'll ask Olivia to answer this, and then we'll move on to the conclusion. So the question's from Ben, and it's, will you talk a little bit about the cohort experience you had with other students while you were in the host country?
Yeah, absolutely. I like saw that in the chat. I was looking forward to answering this one. I think because there's 2 students actually on this call from my NSLI trip. So I was there with Taryn, and then I was also there with my friend Ruby, who's there. Hi. But so no, we've all like remained like super close, and like I was definitely a little bit worried about it like going into the trip, just because like I knew that I would be like on like the older side in terms of age, and I was like knew that I would just be in a different place, like because I was moving on from high school, and a lot of the students on my trip were still like very involved in their high school communities, and I knew that that would be just like a little bit different. So I was like absolutely nervous, but I think that we all like completely embraced each other and like got so close so quickly. We still like always tell each other happy birthday, and like we have a group chat that we're always like texting in, and like anytime that anyone needed something on program, someone was always there. Like if I would be like having a breakdown in school one day, like someone would be like giving me a hug and like getting me some chai, and like we had all sorts of different support going on, just like from our host families and from like IRON and NSLI staff, but also I think like the largest amount of support on the program came from each other and came from like a willingness to be open and vulnerable and supportive to one another. And I think that that was really great to have like sort of a mutual respect, but also a mutual understanding. And I think that also was very useful, not just on program, but after program, when we all came back and started to have the like readjustment experience and like being able to connect with one another in our cohort about all of the experiences that we had was really valuable, and definitely helped readjusting.
Great, thank you so much. It's awesome to hear about how supportive your group was. So that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much for answering to all the panelists. I'm going to take this final minute just to briefly conclude the event and share some resources. So if you would like any more information on the NSLI program application, please visit the NSLI for Youth website at nsliforyouth.org. And if you're interested in reading student alumni stories like the one mentioned by Kane, and also one by Alice was shared in the chat as well, please visit the NSLI Interactive website at nsli-interactive.org. Before you go, I would appreciate if those who are with us could please very quickly fill out a short kind of exit survey about this event. I just put the link in here. It will take you no more than 45 seconds probably to complete. And this is just so we can get some feedback from all of you to make sure that we can continue to implement great virtual events. So I'd really appreciate if you could fill it out. Thank you again so much to all of our wonderful speakers, to our alumni panelists, and to all of our attendees for joining us here today. Have a good night. Goodbye.